Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Jeanette Mancia Martinez, and we're going to go ahead and get started so that we can honor everyone's time. This is the second Peabody Research Spotlight series, and we're very excited to have all of you join us. I'm still letting in a couple more people that are in the waiting room, and I think that process will continue for the first few minutes. But I just wanted to say welcome and let you know that you're in the correct Zoom room. So we're going to kick these things off in just a moment. Okay. All right. Again, welcome everyone who's able to join us for the Peabody Research Series. My name is Jeanette Mancia Martinez. I am the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Graduate Education here at Vanderbilt's Peabody College, and I'm really excited about the 5 presentations that you were here about for today. The purpose of the Peabody Research Spotlight, which we just started in November, that was our inaugural session, and it was quite a success, is really so that everyone can get to know more about the exciting research that is being conducted across the 5 departments at Peabody. Oftentimes we, as is natural and we can all understand, we're so busy with our own work that we are just not able to capitalize on what others are doing and where there are opportunities for interdisciplinary collaborations. So we hope that this is going to be a useful session, certainly for our current PhD students at Peabody and for prospective PhD students as well. And so just a very brief housekeeping. I would really appreciate it if everyone could please mute their microphones. The session is being recorded and we're going to have it available to all because there were some folks who were not able to make it during this exact day and time. And instead of speaking, if you have comments or questions as our presenters are informing us about their research, we would really appreciate it if you could use the chat function and just go ahead and note in there any comments and or questions that you may have. The plan for the day is that we are going to have 5 exciting presentations. You see the lineup here displayed. And again, my doctoral student, Min Oh, has graciously agreed to monitor the chat box, and she will be keeping tracks of comments and questions as they filter in. Following each roughly 5 to 7 minute presentation from each presenter, we will have a brief Q&A session in which Min will pull kind of randomly a couple of questions that you post via the chat box so that the presenters can address. And of course, there's never enough time. So I'm sure all of the presenters, and I include myself in there, are happy to answer any questions that you may have later. And we have their email addresses available for you at the end of the slide. So without any further ado, I am going to go ahead and kick it off with Dr. Ebony McGee.
Thank you so much. I didn't know I was being recorded, so I just threw on a little lip gloss real quick. Okay, well, hello, everybody. Hello, Zoom world. I am loving the chat feature, so feel free to chat me up anytime throughout this hour, and I'll try to reply to your message. So, how did I start off in the world? Where I started off with my graduate education in electrical and then industrial engineering as an engineer. And just like folks are recovering from many things, I am still recovering from my 3-year experience being an engineer. I didn't know I was making great money till I got into academia and found like I just matched my salary like yesterday. So I was making really good money, but I was feeling miserable and I couldn't understand. I didn't have the language to talk about why I wasn't feeling, as great as my community thought I should be feeling. And I really wasn't contributing to society. I didn't want my tombstone to say, she built power products, AC sources, DC sources, power supplies. So I wanted to have a more a more equity-centered approach to my career. Next slide, please. So like many folks that I study high achieving STEMers of color. When you ask them, what are you going to do right after you get your degree, they're very traditional in their pursuits, similar to what you would think one would do with a math degree or a robotics degree. But next slide, please. If you ask them what their future goals are, it is full of equity infused, empathy, caring goals, really wanted to give back and contributing to society. And my path with this was with engineering education, but the folks that I study come from a wide array of future goals. And really they talk about not being able to see their future in their current STEM goals, because the way STEM culture is designed, it's not designed to engage in some of their future goals. So they see that as like a disconnect. Next slide, please. So when I do my research, I focus mostly on higher education. I do some K-12 work. I really focus on what's behind the underrepresentation in STEM. And it's not that mythical pipeline that we hear about all the time. If it is a pipeline, racism created the pipeline. So we really need to look at the structural things that displace students of color on campus. And this includes high achieving students. This list is what high achieving students feel or encounter or have to endure, right? But when people are getting a 3.8 GPA, you don't tend to think that anything is wrong with them. And then everyone else below a 3.8 is matched to them as though they are ideal. And what my research does is it really tries to problematize that success, particularly if you're minoritized and marginalized. Next slide, please. So I thought I was going to come into this pursuit of engineering education, just hearing really these happy, glorious conversations and narratives with underrepresented students, faculty, and staff of color. And you do hear that, particularly the interview starts off really like, I mean, these folks are almost like dag near conceited, but just really confident in their pursuits. And then you ask them something like, tell me about a time that you've been treated unfairly. And these confident, cocky individuals like literally break down, like in the interview, break down. And if you told me, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I would be focusing on mental and physical health, young people having an array of not just mental problems, because, we all like to talk about mental health, but physical health complications as a result of the stress, strain, exhaustion, having to prove oneself over and over and over again, and it doesn't stop because, the PhD doesn't save you either, right? So even folks who get their PhD in nuclear physics still are questioned and still are judged. So this is the complete picture of what STEM success looks if you're Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous, etc. Next slide, please. So I have a great body of research. I mean, I really feel confident in saying that. If you don't believe me, check out my website. You can see it. If you see the little fist, there's www.blackengineeringphd.org. But it's really important for me not to just publish top tier papers that, hopefully 400 people will read, sometimes not, right? It was really important that I made a contribution to uplifting and talking about a balanced perspective of what it's like to be a faculty member. Because even though I'm an African-American female faculty member, and there's a lot of stuff that I could talk about that is not equitable in my position, this is still the best job I ever had. I'm not going nowhere. I'm going to retire as a professor. And what these academics that are on the screen have done is created a series of videos that talks about why they persist in spite of racism, sexism, the stress and strain of trying to be that Black academic, you know, trying to mentor all the Black students in your department, why they still persist. So if you like to look on the website, there's lots of publications too, but what I am most proud of are these videos that are really uplifting and inspiring future generations of STEM faculty of color. And I think I'm right at 6 minutes. So thank you very much. And like I said, I'll move over to the chat to see if there's any questions, or there's a Q&A. I'm sorry.
Yes, there is. Thank you so much, Dr. McGee. That was excellent, as I knew it would be. So Min, can I bother you to please help us facilitate the Q&A based on the comments or questions that have been posed?
Yes, of course. The first question raised is, what are the factors that most help with the stress and strain of these students?
Okay, this is an excellent question. Everybody is on the resilience and grit tip. You know, if you could just have your internal perseverance, if you could just say affirmations in the mirror, I'm here to call BS on that. What resilience without external supports, that means outside of my body. If you don't have external supports and you're asking students to be resilient, what you are really asking them to do is to cope with their continued oppression, right? So my research argues there's nothing wrong with students of color. They are freaking resilient, and now you are trying to break them. So we certainly need external supports. We don't need to ask students to get more gritty, right? We need to ask institutions to meet students and understand the cultural and racial challenges that they face, and for the institutions to change, the departments to change, not the students to change, because nothing is wrong with the students.
Thank you. The second question is, what made you want to study high achieving students specifically in STEM?
Well, I was a high achiever. So I graduated with very nice GPAs, both from my bachelor's in electrical engineering and my master's in industrial engineering. But I felt so incompetent on my job to the point where I started to believe it. You know, so when people put a math test on my desk and they say, oh, this is just a joke, but can you give us the answers in an hour? And I went to a historically Black college, so I had another layer of presumed incompetence. And I just wanted to see if I was alone in the world. You know, was I the only person feeling these feelings? And I got into the research, and they tried to explain it away by saying, oh, it's just imposter syndrome everybody has imposter syndrome. Even white guys have imposter syndrome, but imposter syndrome of people of color masquerades for racism, right? So there is something structural, there's something in the air that is happening to Black and brown students that goes underreported and underacknowledged because we like to sugarcoat and give cookie cutter solutions and think that it applies to all populations. So my focus on high achieving is say, yes, I'm high achieving, but I am still hurting. And you just can't ask me to solve all of this pain. Like, my grit is not going to solve 400 years of structural racism. So we need something else.
Thank you so much again, Dr. McGee. We're going to move forward because I'm sure there are many more comments and questions, and we'll compile those as well and send them your way. So thank you so much. And we're going to move to our next presenter for the day, Dr. Bradley Erford.
Hello, everyone. Go ahead to the next slide, please. My area of research primarily is answering questions like, what do we know that works in counseling? I'm a counselor educator. I'm in the Human and Organizational Development Department and representing CRA. So a lot of my research is around outcomes in counseling and outcome research. However, what I've realized over time that is we know a lot about what is working in counseling, but it is spread all over the literature. So my focus recently has been more on synthesis projects, sort of constructing one-stop shopping centers for everything that we know about what works in this instance or what works in another instance. In a lot of ways, this is a secondary research process. We've all taken surveys. And in a survey, we are trying to get the opinions or the perspectives of individuals. Synthesis research really is, instead of surveying people, synthesis interviews are interviews of published articles and other sources of information, such as dissertations and so forth. So the three topics that I have here in front of you, the meta studies of journal content and so forth, what I'd like you to do right now, because these are actually not difficult to conduct, they just tend to be kind of time consuming. With regard to meta studies of journals or journal content, think about what your favorite journal is. And that's a potential topic for you to do a meta study on. Think on the second bullet, psychometric syntheses of tests or instruments. What's your favorite instrument that you use, or favorite scale, or your favorite test? And then the third one on meta-analyses, what's your favorite intervention, or what's your favorite empirical relationship? These are the types of questions that can be answered with respect to these synthesis procedures. Next slide, please. Um, all of these are relatively easy to conduct. They're just more time consuming. And the other thing that's important is you need two researchers, because there's we always have to code for things independently to make sure that we are arriving at accurate decisions in the data. So this first one is a journal meta study, 5 phases. It's actually quite simple. The first is just what journal do you want to explore, and what is the time range or the age range. I just finished, well, I had about 8 or 10 years ago done a series of these meta studies on counseling journals, about a dozen different journals. I've just replicated a number of those in about 18 counseling journals. They happen to be the journals that are related to the American Counseling Association counseling family. So that was a nice journal set for me to start with. I generally look at 20-year windows when I'm capturing a journal set, because I like to analyze trends over time. So the second phase is really kind of article selection. That's actually relatively easy, which ones are being accepted into and not accepted into. The important thing here, as with all of these, is you need to have 2 independent coders in order to enhance accuracy. Extraction and coding is the third step. And there's actually a list on the next page that we'll get to in a second, so that you can see all of those variables that are very interesting to explore. The interesting part for me is the aggregation and the analysis part, which I generally aggregate into 5-year windows, so that I can see how are the variables actually changing in the journal over time. And then, of course, my favorite part is the writing and submitting for publications. As you can see, as you hit the next slide, please, as you can see, these are very easy to conduct, and it's one of the things I use a lot. I am able to harness graduate students a lot in the coding of these variables in the articles. So it's a great way to bring students into the research agenda, to get some experience with regard to how you do research, about how you write for publication, but also to get them into the literature, so that they're looking at all of the articles. And I can tell you that many have said, I just can't stop reading the articles. I know I'm supposed to be coding these and getting, one after the other, but it's really, they're so exciting to get into the articles. Here's just a sample, a couple of dozen of variables that are very easy to code within. You can see the first probably 12 or 13 of them are what I call author characteristics. The next couple are article characteristics. And then we're particularly interested in the research that's published in these articles, as many are more research oriented than others. Next slide, please. This is just a couple of the meta studies, and you see a number of the students that I've worked with and colleagues over time. And again, there's been about 18 in this series just recently in the last couple of years. Next slide. a psychometric synthesis is if you can think about your favorite scale or test or instrument that you use or have encountered in the literature. It's basically what is known about the psychometric properties. And here we're talking about score reliability, score validity of a well-used or well-known test in the field. Again, just a 5-phase process. The article selection is kind of interesting. Sometimes there have been hundreds of dozens of articles, sometimes hundreds, and sometimes thousands of articles that have been published on popular instruments. We're conducting one right now with the Myers-Briggs, and there have been over 4,000 that have been published in the last almost 20 years on the Myers-Briggs. So that's a more extensive project. Again, extraction and coding, we're using a couple of independent coders in order to enhance the accuracy of the decisions that are made about the variables. In the aggregation and statistical analysis, we're looking at the various facets of reliability, like coefficient alpha or test-retest reliability. Under validity, we're looking at things like concurrent validity, internal structural validity, diagnostic validity for some instruments. And of course, it all comes down to the aggregation analysis and then writing for publication. The important thing about these types of psychometric syntheses is that we oftentimes rely on a lot of the original author articles, and we need to kind of get beyond that and look at the dozens, if not hundreds, of articles that have been published since then. Next slide, you can see some of the articles. And then finally, a meta-analysis, and we're going to have to make this very quick. There's a lot of applications across disciplines. Next slide. These are much more complicated, and you can see there's a 12-step process here that is actually, again, kind of easy to conduct, but is time-intensive. And it all kinds of comes down to, again, writing for publication. And on the next slide, there's a source at the top. This is kind of the top article is my 12-step program for people who want to become addicted to doing meta-analyses. There's an article there that is actually an easy read. The best book that I came across was actually one that was published by Mark Lipsey and Wilson. Mark Lipsey is an emeritus faculty from Peabody, and it was a really easy to use book. And you can see a number of examples of meta-analyses that are more applicable to what we're doing in the counseling profession. But you can apply these to just about anything that you're doing in your discipline of study.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Arford. There was a lot of great information packed in. I know it was a very short slot. So we're going to go ahead and open it up for some questions from the audience. So Min, if you'd be so kind to facilitate that again.
Of course. The question is, what are some of the purposes of doing a journal synthesis and how are they used in the field?
Yeah, we want to see who's publishing within our journals and what is published within our journals, particularly with regard to the research article characteristics. What kind of research designs seem to be popular? Are research studies moving more in the direction of qualitative as opposed to quantitative? Who are participants in our studies? And what kinds of statistics are we using? So it's a way of kind of looking at broad swaths of what is being published in our journal articles, and then tabulating or aggregating them so that then boards, editorial boards, people who are interested in publishing those journals, and then students who are studying what it is that, what's being published in journals can then access that information. These articles oftentimes can lead to sometimes intense discussion amongst editorial boards, as you can imagine, about what is being published. Is the direction or the trajectory that we're on really a positive and promoted trajectory, or do we need to kind of shift and transition and into some new directions? All of those are really kind of grist for the mill for these journal meta studies.
All right, and there's one more question. When you're conducting meta-analyses or systemic reviews, how do you stay organized during the article search and selection process?
Yeah, that really is the key. And I'm old school, so we have a document that has all of the articles in it, and then the coders are going through making decisions on accepts and rejects independently. I collate all of that. serve as the kind of the ultimate judge whenever there may be some disagreements that they weren't able to hash out themselves. And then once those acceptances have been taken, then that's when it moves to the coding process, and we look for effect sizes and so forth. There's some really great software that's available. The one that I have used most extensively is called Comprehensive Meta-Analysis version 3. That is one that you can actually purchase a yearly subscription to. It helps you to compute the effect sizes, and it also gives you some really great graphics that are really easy to import into articles that you're moving forth toward publication.
Thank you so much, Dr. Erford, again. And we will compile any additional comments or questions as well for you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And we're going to go to our third presenter for the afternoon, early evening, Dr. Marcia Barnes.
Hi, everyone. My research really focuses on improving intervention effectiveness, both in mathematics as well as in reading. Next slide. And the framework that I use for this work really is to think about how we can use both the cognitive characteristics and social emotional characteristics that students bring into the learning environment. And also to think about how those characteristics might interact with the instructional environment at hand, or the instructional platform. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, the instructional platform, in this case being a technology-based platform. But the idea is to try to improve the fit of the intervention to the individual, to customize interventions. Next. The project that I'm going to talk about today has to do with our work with adolescents who have reading comprehension difficulties. And it's certainly the case that there's a lot of effective interventions for younger children with reading difficulties, really seen through more of a prevention lens. But it turns out that based on national longitudinal studies, literacy achievement in middle school is actually the strongest predictor of college and career readiness. And so we think about middle school as being this maybe later developmental time window where we can actually try to help some of these students affect positive change in terms of their reading. Now, having said that, these middle school students have had long histories of difficulty with reading. They've developed considerable anxiety around reading. So for example, in the study I'm going to tell you about, fully almost 45% of the students, of the middle school students, had anxiety in the borderline clinical to clinical ranges. So it's pretty significant levels of anxiety. And then there's, typical teenage distractions. So thinking about relationships and these sorts of things. I'm going to talk about this as mind wandering. This is really sort of a difficulty in controlling, in internal control of attention to a task at hand. And we all do it, of course. I've been doing a ton of it in the last couple of weeks. But it is something that we all do, but also some individuals tend to do more than others, and it does affect reading comprehension. The other thing about middle school is there's just simply less time and fewer resources for interventions for struggling learners. So if you think about English language arts teachers, their role is really teaching literature, and fewer of them see themselves as teaching reading per se. Next. So the study I'm going to talk about in terms of the intervention we designed and tested came from earlier work with a large number of secondary school students. And this modeling work showed that inference making actually had the largest direct effects on reading comprehension in these later grades. What do I mean by inference making? Everything from a pretty low level in the text, assigning the right referent to a pronoun. So if you don't know who did what to whom, you're going to have a lot of trouble understanding what you read. Also linking up ideas within the text to promote, to make meaning of the text. And then finally, to use your general knowledge of the world as you're reading the text, because authors don't put in everything in the text that you need in order to understand. So based on some cognitive models of inference making, as well as using cognitive principles of interlead practice and feedback, we designed an inference making intervention, which we call Connect It, stands for connecting text through inferencing and technology. We designed it so that the same content was delivered either by a teacher in small groups or through computer. And we wanted to design a computer version to address those realities of the middle school environment with less time for, what are considered to be sort of best practices in terms of small group interventions. And in a small randomized pilot study, we compared those two connected platforms to whatever the school was providing in terms of remedial instruction. And we also asked whether those student characteristics that I talked about before, anxiety, mind wandering, would moderate or interact with these any intervention effects we got. Next. This is just an example of a pronoun reference from one of the lessons. We're always driving students back into the text to find the answers to connect up what they're reading. Next. So in general, the teacher-led connected intervention was superior in terms of reading comprehension outcomes to the computer-delivered intervention with the same content and also to the school interventions. But there's nuance to these findings because the computer intervention was particularly not helpful for students who had been English language learners 3 years or more before we worked with them, for boys. But the students who benefited in terms of their reading comprehension from the computer intervention were those who were higher in anxiety and who also reported themselves as having more mind wandering. And this is work done by Amanda Martinez Lincoln, published in the Annals of Dyslexia, just came out for her dissertation. Next. So we're excited about this work. We are funded to do a randomized control trial to try to replicate some of this work, including the work with on anxiety and mind wandering. We're trying to get a better idea of what's going on with our computer data, for example, to understand what boys are doing, and also seeing if we can take some of what the good things that are happening in our teacher-led lessons and engineering them into the computerized lessons. Of course, there are some limitations to that. And next slide. So research like this, takes an academic village, and that's certainly true for our research. I would just like to really give a call out to the new graduate students who are working on the new Connect It project. And they are doc students Amanda Miller and Melanie Chong, and master students Salome Desa and Victoria Stewart. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnes. That was great. And I know that there are questions and comments in the chat box, so I'm going to let Min facilitate that part for us. Thanks again.
Yep. Dr. Barnes, the first question is the connected intervention accessible in an ELA classroom to help the general ed teacher hold the inclusive classroom?
It's not available yet. I mean, it could be available, but we haven't made it available yet because we actually haven't done the kind of work, we've just done pilot studies. So we haven't done the kind of work that we think we would need to do, but that's what we're doing next, except that I should say we're not testing it in the classroom, but I think that's a really interesting question in terms of whether one could do that.
Great, thank you. The second question is, Jessica wonders how accessing remedial instruction through a computer in a general education setting, for example, could remove the potential stigma of spending more time in a, for example, a pull-out resource setting.
Yes, so I think that was based on our qualitative data that we collected in our pilot work. You know, that was some of the information that we also got from teachers and students, is that the technology-based intervention would be the one, that's most feasible in a regular classroom without pulling students, number one. And number two, I think those anxiety findings are pretty interesting in this respect, because they suggested to us that there is something going on when students who are struggling are interacting with other students around reading, for example, that they don't necessarily feel when they're on the computer. There's a lot of other computer programs going on in these classrooms as well. So yes, I do think it could be a means to reduce stigmatization.
Thank you so much, Dr. Barnes. And just in the interest of time, we're going to go to our next speaker. But again, we'll compile these for you. That was excellent. And we're going to go to our fourth speaker for today, and that is Dr. Dwayne Watson.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Today, I'm going to be talking about politics and language. And this is really the work of Maya Ricketts. You can see her in the lower left-hand corner. She's a lab coordinator in my lab and was an undergrad here at Vanderbilt, and my collaborator, Ben Schultz. Next slide, please. So my research is on language. I'm interested in the cognitive and brain processes that underlie language production, speech, language comprehension, reading, and individual differences in reading. But today I'm going to talk about one study that I'm kind of excited about. It's hot off the presses on speech rate and language choices. Next slide, please. So speech rate is exactly what you think it is. It's basically how quickly and how slowly you speak. English is interesting because it's a lot like music. It has beats to it, and those beats can be fast or slow. And one of the things I noticed when I moved to Nashville 4 years ago from Central Illinois is that folks' speech rate is a lot slower down here. Interestingly, I found that I myself would speak with a slow speech rate when I was talking to a Southerner. And that phenomenon is called language convergence. And language convergence is actually pretty common. Anytime you have a conversation with someone, your language becomes like their language. So you tend to use the same words, you tend to use the same grammar, you say things in the same way. And basically, there's two theories about why this is. One theory is that we do this basically to be efficient. It's easier to understand someone if you're talking the way they do. But the other theory is that you're doing it to signal information about yourself, either that you're in the same social group as them, or maybe that you like them, or that you like what they're saying. And so we were really interested in understanding which of these two theories is right. And so we were interested in this question of whether speech rate converges all the time, or is it influenced by social factors? And we decided to look at political opinion as a potential social moderator of this effect. Next slide, please. So basically what we did is we had strangers come into our lab and we just had them have a conversation. And we recorded them while they talked about a topic we gave them. And the topics were pretty mundane. So for example, one was, we told them to imagine that they were going to a grocery store and had to buy food for a friend, and their friend's diabetic, and the friend requested sugar, like chocolate, and what would they do? And so they had to talk about how they would navigate that situation. But before they had that conversation, critically, we gave them a political question, and we gave them cards that were marked yes or no, and they had to indicate with the card whether they agreed with the political opinion or not. And so critically, their partner could see what their stance was on that political opinion, if you will. And then as a control, we had non-political opinions. And the question was, would having the same political opinion increase the amount of language convergence that we see? Next slide. So the political statements and opinions, these are just some examples. So things like climate change is important, the United States needs to institute gun reform, abortion's morally wrong. And then we had control conditions, pineapple is a great topping for pizza, Popeyes has the best fried chicken. Actually, this one was really controversial. If I were to do this again, I would not have included that. People had some serious opinions about fried chicken and hot chicken, and particularly, but that's what we picked. Next slide. So I'm just going to sort of give you a gloss of the results. So did everyone converge? The answer is yes, everyone did converge. But for our second question, does political affiliation determine convergence? And here the data is a little bit more tricky, and so I'll go through it. Next slide. So here's a graph showing the rate of convergence. This looks a little confusing, but basically on that y-axis, all that measure is how much language convergence we saw. So the higher the bar, the more the folks having the conversation converge. And it looks like there's a difference here, but there's really not. We didn't find any kind of convergence depending on whether the opinions were political or not. Next slide, please. But if we look at polarization, so forgetting the political question and just collapsing over whether you agree with your partner or not, here we see effects of political effects such that the more polarized you are on the right, high polarization, the less convergence that you see. People who agreed more converged more. Next slide. So interestingly, after they had the conversation, we gave them a survey away from their partner. And we asked them whether they were honest in their response to the survey, because you can imagine reasons why people might not want to share their political opinion. And we found that honesty had an effect. So if one of the people in the conversation was dishonest, there was significantly less convergence than if they were honest. Next slide. And we also found effects of sex within our conversational pair. So same-sex conversational partners converged less than different sex conversational partners, which we think is really interesting. So we see these sort of social effects playing a role. Next slide. So basically what we found is that everyone converges independent of social factors, but these social factors seem to matter. They control the amount of convergence. And this depends on things like honesty, whether you agree with the other person, and whether you're of the same sex as the other person. And so our next steps, we're basically interested in understanding why these social factors matter. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we can't have folks in the lab. So what we've turned to is analyzing bodies of audio data. So we're analyzing political debates. Maya, the first author on the study, is going through and wants to analyze the show Real Housewives, because there's lots of conflict there. And so we're interested in the amount of convergence in that recorded speech. And that's what I have. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. That was really fascinating. So I'm sure there are some interesting questions for you. So Min, if you would not mind.
Yes, Dr. Watson, are there other measurable factors of speech convergence besides speech rate, such as intonation or rate of filler words, perhaps?
Yes, there is actually. So I also do research on intonation and filler words. And we do find that, in fact, people do tend to converge for things like intonation. People have studied intonation quite a bit. I mean, there's been research on couples and couples counseling and finding more versus less convergence, depending on whether the couple agree or don't agree on a particular point of contention in the counseling. So this convergence happens at a lot of different levels. For us, speech rate is really easy to measure. We've created some scripts to automatically analyze the data, and so that makes it kind of simple to look at.
Thank you. One more question for you. For language convergence, is there a determining factor as to who leads or follows, or do people tend to meet somewhere in the middle?
That is a great question. So the answer is both. There is some meeting in the middle, but there do tend to be leaders in conversations. And it often is moderated by social factors, things like power in the relationship. All the things that you'd expect to matter tend to matter. So it is kind of almost like dancing. There is this sort of mutual give and take, but there does tend to be a leader in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. We're going to move ahead with our very last but not least presenter for the afternoon, evening. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Ellen Goldring.
Thank you, and I appreciate everyone's patience. This has been really fun for me to go last so I could learn more about what my colleagues are studying. I'm a professor in education policy and leadership, but I'm also the editor-in-chief of one of the major journals in education, American Educational Research Journal, so I'm happy to take questions about that as well. Next slide. So my research is quite different from everybody else's in that I'm most focused on improving education systems. And one of the ways to think about improving educational systems, such as school districts or states, is through both policy and also leadership. So those are my areas of focus. And one of the things that we think about is this notion of coherence. How are policies implemented such that they achieve their intended effects across multiple layers of the system, and also how we can improve leaders that are responsible for implementing policies, and also thinking about the unintended or the differential implementation effects of policies as they're implemented. And so much of my research focuses on central office, the types of supports provided to school leaders for ongoing development, and then also how these opportunities and policies lead to inequality or access and inclusion. Next slide. My research is typically mixed methods. I do field research in collaboration, mostly with urban school districts. As I mentioned, I study implementation through surveys, interviews, and using administrative data. I'm very interested in what happens and why. What are the outcomes of the interventions, but particularly focusing on the context and variation and unintended consequences. And as has been said here, all of my projects are quite large scale with multiple collaborators, both colleagues here at Vanderbilt and elsewhere, and of course, PhD students. Next slide. So I'm just going to run through some of the types of projects that I have done over the years. I'm not going to tell you the results, so you can Google the articles, or I'm happy to answer questions, but I thought it would be helpful to get a sense of the type of research that I do and many of my colleagues in LPO. So sometimes we do randomized experiments where we're actually designing interventions to improve school leadership in this case. And there's been a lot of criticism of the lack of effectiveness and efficacy of professional development for teachers and school leaders, and that it's very one size fits all. So in this experiment, we designed a system of ongoing feedback and coaching for school principals. States have mandated performance evaluation for principals, but in general, the type of feedback principals receive or leaders receive on how to try to improve their schools and their own leadership practice is very limited and not very effective. And so we developed an intervention where we provided leaders with feedback. Very prevalent outside of education is this notion of 360-degree feedback, where you're receiving feedback from teachers in this case, and supervisors. And then principals received their feedback and they were coached on how to interpret the feedback. And one of the most interesting outcomes of this study is we developed a model. This was with a colleague from the psychology department, really understanding what happens when your assessment of yourself is way above that of your teachers, or vice versa, underrating and overrating. And then we studied leadership improvement as the outcome variable in this study. So we've done quite a few interventions. Next slide. A lot of my work is studying implementation of large-scale initiatives. The initiatives are also often initiated either by states or by foundations. A study that we just recently completed was a study in 6 urban districts where the point was to try to transform the role of principal supervisors from one of compliance and administration to one of focusing on instructional leadership and developing the capacity of school principals. Here we studied both what happened, what were the implementation outcomes, as well as how did the supervisory practices of these particular districts compare to those of a set of urban districts that were not in this particular implementation policy. This was a very large-scale, comprehensive urban school district design process. Next slide. Another study which really aligns with my interest in implementation was a study of take-up, really asking this question, should states or districts mandate take-up of interventions, or should they be voluntary so that principals have the autonomy to determine what processes best meet their needs? This was actually a statewide randomized experiment, but the take-up was voluntary. And this was a study where we matched teachers who were high achieving teachers or highly evaluated on the state evaluation system with a teacher needing support. So they were called pairs or matches. And we studied how principals implemented this matching to develop improved teacher teaching, highly effective teaching, and also why principals decided to take up this voluntary intervention, and really wrestled with this notion of mandatory versus voluntary take up of policies, even if there are positive effects. Next slide. And lastly, this is a recent study. Actually, Brad, we have completed a comprehensive review and new analyses of national data on the role of assistant principals in the principal pipeline. So one thing that's quite prevalent is that there's a shortage of high quality school principals. There's very high turnover among school principals, and there's a lack of diversity among school principals, and assistant principals can play an important role in this pipeline. And so what we found is looking at data from the National Center on Educational Statistics that principals of color are more likely to have experience as assistant principals than white principals. And this is actually an increasing trend. But of course, we don't know why. And we also don't know what's the outcome of that. So sometimes my studies actually are what we call hypothesis generating, and we can observe a pattern and we can describe a pattern, but then we need to propose studies that help us study the phenomena. And this is an example of that. So there is some, and we've discussed these findings in partners with districts, and there is some concern that assistant principals of color might be quote unquote stuck in this stepping stone position and not being moved forward, don't have the opportunity to move forward to the principalship. On the other hand, the general career trajectory for all principals is that assistant principals are a really good mentoring and training opportunity. However, if the mentoring and training is not an opportunity, but particular leadership tasks are being assigned that actually don't lend well to learning the job of the principalship, it could be detrimental and also lead to turnover, stepping out of the career. So this is a new line of research that we're just starting. Actually, it's not released yet, but a report will be forthcoming in March. So that's kind of the type of research that my colleagues and I do, looking at ways to intervene in the system, both studying outcomes of interventions, but also just looking at the patterns and trying to understand why, and then how we can work with districts to improve student achievement and other important outcomes for children. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Goldring. That was great and very clever to keep us at a cliffhanger to see, like, what did she find? So I'm sure there's
you can go either way. Choose one. 6 minutes is pretty fast.
That is very true. You guys all did an excellent job adhering to that. So thank you. So we're going to open it up for a Q&A for you, Dr. Goldring. So Min,
Sure.
You can take over, please.
Yeah, the first question is, There can be a clear disconnect between individual school communities and the functionings of the Board of Education. Have you done research on the effectiveness of Board of Education as a result of positive collaboration between Board of Education and their communities?
I personally have not, but there is a large body of work in that area. So there are many colleagues that study the politics of education. We have done work on communities, but not at the board level, but that is definitely a field of study. And so you can definitely look for that. And there's some amazing books that have really done full ethnographies and case studies on that topic as well. Very interesting work.
Thank you. The last question is, what did you find about voluntary versus mandatory uptake?
Yeah, so of course, like everything, it's very complicated and nuanced. But for an intervention that is focused on professional development of teachers, we did find that in general, if the policy or the program, in this case it was an intervention, really aligned with prior goals that the principals had for their teachers in their school, they tend to implement closer to fidelity and get more buy-in from their teachers. So in the implementation work in schools, there's a lot of literature on pre-existing conditions or context of implementation. And so that alignment in the voluntary context really did make a big difference versus those that took it up because they perhaps perceived that their superintendent actually was making them do it, quote unquote, forcing them to do it, or because they thought, well, since the invitation came from the state, that they needed to do it. So it's complicated as always, but voluntary suggests more alignment with context and goals, which really helps implementation and outcomes.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Goldring. And I'm actually going to give back everyone 2 or 3 minutes, if you can believe that or not. Everyone was so timely. I can't tell you how much we appreciate that and how much we appreciate everyone who was able to join us this afternoon, early evening. I can tell you that I sure learned a lot, and we don't have too many of these opportunities, and that's why we're providing this avenue to do more of this. So thank you for joining our second Peabody Research Spotlight. There will be more, so stay tuned, including presentations by current PhD students at Peabody, recent PhD students from Peabody, and research labs, including thematically related work. So that should hopefully be happening towards the end of February, early March. We will send that out and help spread the word. And again, thank you all so much, and I hope you have a good rest of your week and a fantastic semester. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jeanette. You were great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, man.